The morning sun barely touched the horizon when Captain Rachel Morgan stepped through the gates of Fort Henderson. The military base sat on the outskirts of a small Kentucky town, surrounded by rolling hills and thick forests. Rachel had been stationed here for 3 weeks, transferred from a combat zone overseas where she had earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star for valor. Nobody at Fort Henderson knew about her medals. Nobody knew what she had done, and that was exactly how she wanted it. Rachel was 32 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun and eyes that had seen too much for someone her age. She stood 5'6", lean and strong from years of military training. Her uniform was always pressed perfectly, her boots polished to a mirror shine. She believed in doing things right, even when nobody was watching. Fort Henderson was a supply and logistics base, nothing like the forward operating bases where Rachel had spent the last 4 years. This was supposed to be her recovery posting, a quiet place where she could heal from the things she had seen and done. But quiet did not mean easy. From her first day, she felt the weight of judgment from the men around her. Fort Henderson was old-school military, run mostly by officers who had never seen real combat. The base commander, Colonel Marcus Webb, was a large man in his 50s with a thick neck and a voice that could shake windows. He had spent most of his career behind a desk, managing supplies and personnel. Colonel Webb did not like women in combat roles. He made that clear in the way he looked at Rachel, in the way he spoke to her like she was a child who had wandered into the wrong room. "Captain Morgan," he had said on her first day, looking down at her paperwork with a frown, "I see you have some combat experience. Well, things are different here. We run a tight ship. We do not need heroics or drama. We need people who can follow orders and do their jobs quietly. Do you understand?" Rachel had stood at attention, her face expressionless. "Yes, sir. Good. You will be overseeing the supply depot in Sector C. It is a simple job. Keep the inventory straight, make sure nothing goes missing, and stay out of trouble. Can you handle that?" "Yes, sir." Colonel Webb had dismissed her with a wave of his hand, already looking at other papers on his desk. Rachel had saluted and left, feeling the familiar burn of disrespect in her chest. But she had learned long ago to swallow that burn, to let it fuel her work instead of her anger. The supply depot in Sector C was a collection of large metal warehouses filled with everything from ammunition to medical supplies. Rachel's job was to manage a team of 15 soldiers, mostly enlisted men who resented taking orders from a woman. Her second-in-command was a staff sergeant named Holloway, a man in his late 30s with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. From the beginning, Holloway made things difficult. "Morning, Captain," he would say, his voice dripping with false respect. "What complicated orders do you have for us today? Maybe something really challenging like counting boxes or sweeping floors." The other soldiers would snicker, watching to see how Rachel would respond. She never rose to the bait. She would simply give her orders clearly and walk away, leaving Holloway to stew in his own bitterness. But the harassment grew worse as the weeks went on. Rachel would find her paperwork mysteriously missing from her desk. Equipment she had ordered would be delivered to the wrong location. Once, she discovered that someone had written a crude word across her locker in the changing room. She cleaned it off without reporting it, knowing that complaining would only make her look weak in Colonel Webb's eyes. The base was preparing for a major inspection by the Army Inspector General, scheduled for 3 months away. The inspection would evaluate everything from combat readiness to supply management to personnel welfare. A poor showing could end careers and shut down facilities. Colonel Webb was obsessed with making sure Fort Henderson passed with flying colors. Rachel threw herself into preparing her section. She worked 12-hour days, reorganizing the depot, updating inventory systems, and training her reluctant team. She stayed late into the evenings, double-checking manifests and fixing errors that should never have existed in the first place. One evening, about 2 weeks before the story's main event, Rachel was working alone in the depot's office. It was past 9 o'clock, and the base was quiet. She was reviewing shipping records when she noticed something strange. Several high-value items, including night vision equipment and tactical radios, had been signed out over the past 6 months but never signed back in. The signature on the forms was illegible, but the approving officer's name was clear: Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway. Rachel's stomach tightened. This was not just poor record-keeping. This looked like theft. She dug deeper, pulling records from the past year. The pattern was clear. Every few weeks, valuable equipment would be signed out for training exercises or maintenance checks and never returned. The total value had to be close to $200,000. Rachel sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew she should report this immediately, but she also knew how it would look. A female officer, barely at the base for 3 weeks, accusing a veteran staff sergeant of theft. Colonel Webb would not believe her. He would probably accuse her of trying to shift blame for her own poor management. She needed more evidence. She needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss. Over the next week, Rachel quietly investigated. She talked to soldiers who had been at the base longer, asking casual questions about equipment and procedures. She reviewed security camera footage from the depot, staying late to watch hours of recordings. She discovered that Holloway had a pattern. Every 6 weeks or so, he would load equipment into a civilian truck late at night, always when he thought nobody was watching. But someone was watching. Rachel had been watching for 3 nights straight when she finally captured clear footage of Holloway loading boxes into a truck driven by a man in civilian clothes. The boxes were marked with inventory numbers that matched the missing equipment. Rachel made copies of everything and secured them in 3 different locations, including a file uploaded to a secure military server with instructions to be opened if anything happened to her. She had learned in combat to always have a backup plan. She was ready to report her findings to Colonel Webb when everything fell apart. It was a Tuesday morning, cold and overcast. Rachel arrived at the depot at 6:30, as she always did. Holloway was already there, which was unusual. He was standing near her office with 4 other soldiers, all loyal to him. They were talking in low voices, and they stopped abruptly when they saw Rachel approaching. "Good morning, Sergeant," Rachel said, her tone professional. "Captain," Holloway replied, but there was something different in his voice, something dangerous. Rachel felt a prickle of warning but pushed it aside. She had faced enemy soldiers with machine guns. She was not going to be intimidated by a thief in her own depot. She went into her office and immediately knew something was wrong. Her desk had been searched. Papers were slightly out of place, and her computer screen was still warm, as if someone had just been using it. Rachel's hand went to her pocket, where she kept a USB drive with copies of her evidence. It was still there. She relaxed slightly and turned to leave the office, planning to go directly to the base provost marshal to make her report. Holloway was standing in the doorway, blocking her path. "Somewhere, Captain?" he asked. "Move aside, Sergeant," Rachel said firmly. "I think we need to talk first." "We can talk later. I have an appointment." Holloway did not move. The 4 soldiers who had been with him earlier now stood behind him, forming a wall of bodies. Rachel's pulse quickened, but she kept her face calm. "I said move, Sergeant. That is an order." "You know what your problem is, Captain," Holloway said, his voice low and mean. "You think you are special because you are a woman. You think you can come in here and play soldier and everyone will respect you. But we all know the truth. You probably slept your way through the ranks. You probably got your medals for opening your legs instead of fighting." The words hit Rachel like physical blows, but she did not flinch. She had heard worse. She had been insulted by men who were now dead, and she would not let this coward shake her. "You are relieved of duty, Sergeant Holloway," she said, her voice cold and steady. "Report to your quarters immediately. I will be filing charges against you for insubordination and conduct unbecoming." Holloway laughed, and the soldiers behind him laughed too. It was an ugly sound, full of contempt and cruelty. "You are not filing anything," Holloway said. "Because if you try, I will make sure everyone on this base knows what a fraud you are. I will tell them how you could not even manage a simple supply depot, how equipment went missing on your watch." "Who do you think Colonel Webb will believe? Me, a man who has been here for 8 years? Or you, some combat Barbie who probably has PTSD and cannot handle a desk job?" Rachel felt something cold settle in her chest. Holloway knew she had discovered the theft. He must have realized she was investigating, and now he was trying to turn it around on her. "Get out of my way," Rachel said quietly. "Make me." It was the wrong thing to say. Rachel had spent 4 years in combat zones where hesitation meant death. She had learned to act decisively, to strike first when threatened. Her training took over. She moved forward, intending to push past Holloway. He grabbed her arm roughly, his fingers digging into her flesh. Rachel twisted, using a joint lock technique to break his grip. Holloway swore and swung at her with his other hand. Rachel blocked the punch and drove her elbow into his ribs, just hard enough to make him let go. But she had underestimated how far Holloway was willing to go, and she had forgotten that they were not alone. The 4 soldiers surged forward, grabbing Rachel's arms and pinning her against the wall. She struggled, but 4 men were too many, even for her training. "Hold her still," Holloway said, breathing hard and rubbing his ribs. "Sergeant, this is assault," Rachel said, forcing herself to stay calm. "Let me go now, and I will only charge you with insubordination." "Or not charging me with anything," Holloway said. He stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You are going to forget everything you think you know. You are going to keep your mouth shut and do your job, and if you do not, I will make your life so miserable that you will beg for a transfer." Rachel looked him in the eye. "I will never stop, I will never quit, and you will face justice for what you have done." Holloway's face twisted with rage. "You stupid woman, you just could not leave it alone." He pulled back his fist and punched Rachel in the face. The blow caught her on the cheek, snapping her head to the side. Pain exploded through her skull and she tasted blood. The soldiers holding her arms tightened their grip, keeping her upright. For a moment the room spun. Rachel's vision blurred and she felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with being hit. She had been hurt worse in combat, but this was different. This was being attacked by people who were supposed to be on her side. "Let that be a lesson," Holloway said, shaking out his hand. "Next time it will be worse." And that was when the door to the depot crashed open. 3 men strode in, their uniforms unmistakable even in Rachel's blurred vision. The stars on their shoulders glinted in the fluorescent light. 1 star, 2 stars, 3 stars. A brigadier general, a major general, a lieutenant general. The soldiers holding Rachel immediately released her and snapped to attention. Holloway's face went white as a sheet. The lieutenant general in the front was a tall man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes like flint. He took in the scene with one sweeping glance, Rachel with blood on her face, the soldiers at attention, Holloway frozen in the middle of the room. "What in God's name is going on here?" The general's voice boomed through the depot like thunder. Nobody answered. Nobody dared to breathe. The general's eyes fixed on Rachel. "Captain, are you injured?" Rachel straightened, wiping blood from her lip with the back of her hand. Every instinct told her to say she was fine, to not show weakness. But she was done protecting people who did not deserve it. "Yes, sir," she said clearly. "Staff Sergeant Holloway struck me in the face after I attempted to report evidence of theft and corruption to the proper authorities." The general's expression hardened into something terrifying. He turned to the 2 generals behind him. "Major General Patterson, secure this facility. Nobody enters or leaves. Brigadier General Morrison, place Staff Sergeant Holloway and these 4 soldiers under arrest immediately. I want them in confinement within 5 minutes." "Yes, sir," both generals responded in unison. Military police seemed to materialize out of nowhere, moving with crisp efficiency. Within seconds, Holloway and the 4 soldiers were in handcuffs, being read their rights. Holloway looked like he might vomit. The lieutenant general walked over to Rachel, his expression softening slightly. "Captain Morgan, I am Lieutenant General James Hawthorne. I apologize that it took us this long to get here. We have been conducting a covert investigation into irregularities at Fort Henderson for the past 3 months. Your name came up in our inquiries, and we have been monitoring your activities. We were on our way to make contact with you when our surveillance team reported an altercation in this building." Rachel's mind reeled. They had been watching her for 3 months. "Sir, I do not understand," she said. "You will," General Hawthorne said. "But first, let us get you medical attention. And then, Captain, you and I need to have a very long conversation about what you have discovered." As military medics arrived to check Rachel's injuries, she watched Holloway being led away in handcuffs. He looked back at her once, his face full of hatred and fear. Rachel touched her swollen cheek and allowed herself a small, grim smile. This was not over. This was just beginning. The base hospital was quiet at this early hour. Rachel sat on an examination table while a doctor shined a light in her eyes and checked her jaw for fractures. Her cheek was already swelling, turning a deep purple that would probably last for weeks, but nothing was broken. "You are lucky, Captain," the doctor said. "This could have been much worse. I am prescribing ice packs and pain medication. No duty for 48 hours. "Doctor, I need to get back to work," Rachel protested. "That was not a suggestion, Captain. It was an order. You have a concussion, even if it is mild. You need rest." Before Rachel could argue further, the door opened and General Hawthorne entered, followed by the two other generals. The doctor took one look at the stars on their shoulders and quietly excused himself. General Hawthorne pulled up a chair and sat down across from Rachel. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his eyebrows, and something else: respect. "Captain Morgan," he began, "I owe you an explanation. 3 months ago, the Army Criminal Investigation Division received an anonymous tip about corruption at Fort Henderson. Equipment was going missing, records were being falsified, and there were indications that someone was selling military property on the black market." Rachel listened, her mind sharp despite the throbbing in her head. "We sent in undercover investigators, but they could not identify the source. Whoever was running the operation was smart and careful. Then your transfer orders came through, and someone at CID noticed your record. 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, multiple commendations for valor and integrity. You had the perfect background for someone we could trust in a difficult situation." "You wanted me to investigate," Rachel said slowly. "No," General Hawthorne said. "We wanted you to do your job honestly, and we believed that your integrity would force the corruption to the surface. We were right. Within 3 weeks, you found evidence that our investigators had been searching for months. You did it quietly, carefully, and thoroughly." Rachel felt a strange mix of emotions: anger that she had been used without her knowledge, relief that she had not been alone, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. "Sir, with respect, you could have told me," she said. "No, we could not," General Hawthorne said firmly. "If you had known you were being watched, your behavior would have changed, the suspects would have noticed. And frankly, Captain, we needed to be sure about you too. We needed to know that you were exactly who your record said you were." "And am I?" Rachel asked quietly. General Hawthorne smiled. "You are everything your record says and more. I watched the security footage from this morning, Captain. You showed remarkable restraint. Most soldiers with your combat training would have put Holloway on the ground the moment he touched you, but you tried to de-escalate. You followed protocol. You only defended yourself when you had no choice. That is the mark of a true soldier." Major General Patterson stepped forward. She was a woman in her 50s with sharp features and kind eyes. "Captain, we have reviewed all the evidence you compiled. The documentation is flawless. You have identified not just Staff Sergeant Holloway, but an entire network of theft that extends beyond this base. The equipment was being sold to a criminal organization that specializes in military hardware. Because of your work, we can shut down the entire operation." "How many people are involved?" Rachel asked. "At least 15 on this base alone," Brigadier General Morrison said. He was a compact man with the build of a former infantry soldier. "Including 2 officers. And Captain, I regret to inform you that Colonel Webb was aware of the theft." Rachel's stomach dropped. "The base commander, not directly involved in the stealing," General Morrison clarified, "but he knew it was happening and chose to look the other way. In exchange, Holloway and his people made sure that Webb's supply records always looked perfect for inspections. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement. Webb got to keep his command and his reputation, and Holloway got to keep stealing." Rachel thought about all the times Colonel Webb had dismissed her concerns, had told her to be quiet and stay out of trouble. He had not been incompetent, he had been complicit. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," General Hawthorne said, "we clean house. Colonel Webb will be relieved of command today. Court-martial proceedings will begin within the week for everyone involved, and Fort Henderson will undergo a complete restructuring." He paused, looking at Rachel with an expression she could not quite read. "Captain, I have a question for you. Why did you keep investigating even when you knew it was dangerous? You could have ignored what you found. You could have asked for a transfer. Why did you stay?" Rachel considered the question. She thought about the soldiers who had died beside her in combat, men and women who had trusted her to lead them. She thought about the oath she had taken when she joined the army, the promise to protect and defend. "Because it was the right thing to do, sir," she said simply. "I did not join the army to ignore corruption. I did not survive 4 years of combat to come home and let thieves steal from the soldiers who are still fighting. It does not matter if someone hits me or threatens me or calls me names. The mission is more important than my feelings." General Hawthorne nodded slowly. "That is exactly the answer I expected from you, Captain." He stood up, and the other 2 generals followed suit. "Captain Morgan, you are being reassigned effective immediately. You will be joining my staff at the Pentagon as a special advisor on integrity and ethics in military supply chains. Consider it a promotion, though the paperwork will take a few weeks to process." Rachel's eyes widened. "Sir, I do not know what to say." "Say yes," Major General Patterson said with a smile. "The Army needs officers like you, Captain. Officers who cannot be bought, intimidated, or silenced. Officers who do the right thing even when it is hard." "Yes, sir," Rachel said, coming to attention despite the doctor's orders to rest. "I accept." "Good," General Hawthorne said. "Take your 48 hours to recover. General Morrison will handle the investigation here and make sure you get your personal effects. When you are ready, report to the Pentagon. Someone will be in touch with the details." The 3 generals saluted Rachel, a gesture of respect from senior officers to a junior one that was rarely seen. Rachel saluted back, feeling tears prick at her eyes for the first time since Holloway had hit her. After they left, Rachel sat alone in the examination room. She touched her swollen cheek and thought about everything that had happened. 3 weeks ago, she had arrived at Fort Henderson expecting a quiet assignment, a place to heal. Instead, she had uncovered corruption, been assaulted by someone she outranked, and emerged with a new position that would shape the rest of her career. She thought about Holloway, sitting in a cell somewhere on base, facing decades in military prison. She thought about Colonel Webb, whose career was over, whose reputation would be destroyed. Part of her felt satisfaction at their downfall, but mostly she just felt tired. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Rachel stayed in her quarters on base, icing her face and sleeping more than she had in months. Military police came and went, asking questions about the theft and the assault. She answered everything honestly and completely. On the 3rd day, Rachel learned that the story had leaked to the media. News crews gathered outside Fort Henderson's gates, reporting on the corruption scandal and the female officer who had exposed it. Rachel refused all interview requests. This was not about glory or recognition. This was about doing her job. She also learned that Staff Sergeant Holloway had been trying to make a deal, claiming he had been pressured into the theft scheme by higher-ranking officers. Nobody believed him. The evidence Rachel had gathered was too thorough, too clear. Colonel Webb resigned from the Army in disgrace, forfeiting his pension and facing possible criminal charges. 2 captains and a major were also implicated and arrested. The investigation spread to other bases, uncovering similar theft operations at 3 other locations. 1 week after the assault, Rachel drove to the depot one last time to collect her personal belongings. The building felt different now, quieter and somehow cleaner. A new captain had already taken over, a man from General Hawthorne's staff who specialized in supply chain security. As Rachel packed up her desk, she found something tucked into one of her drawers, a letter from the soldiers who had worked under her. It was signed by 12 of the 15 men in her unit, everyone except Holloway and the 4 who had helped him. "Captain Morgan," the letter read, "we are sorry for how we treated you. We were wrong to doubt you, wrong to disrespect you, and wrong to follow Holloway. You showed us what real leadership looks like. You never gave up, even when we made things hard for you. You did the right thing even though you knew it would cost you. We hope someday we can be half the soldier you are. Thank you for your service and your courage." Rachel read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in her pocket. This, more than any promotion or commendation, was what mattered. She had earned the respect of the soldiers she led, not through fear or intimidation, but through integrity and strength. Her final stop before leaving Fort Henderson was the base cemetery, a small plot of land where soldiers who had died in training accidents were buried. Rachel stood at one grave in particular, belonging to a young private who had died in a vehicle accident 5 years earlier. She did not know the soldier, but she knew what it meant to serve and to sacrifice. "I tried to do right by you all," she said quietly to the grave. "I hope it was enough." As Rachel drove away from Fort Henderson for the last time, she passed the front gates where reporters were still camped out. They shouted questions at her car, but she kept driving, her eyes on the road ahead. The Pentagon was waiting. A new assignment, new challenges, new chances to make a difference. Rachel knew there would be more corrupt officers, more thieves, more people who would underestimate her because she was a woman. But she also knew she would face them the same way she had faced Holloway, with courage, integrity, and an unshakable commitment to doing what was right. 6 months later, Rachel stood in a ceremony room at the Pentagon, surrounded by fellow officers and military dignitaries. General Hawthorne was pinning a meritorious service medal to her uniform, recognizing her actions at Fort Henderson. "Captain Morgan," the general said loud enough for everyone to hear, "you exemplify the values that make our Army strong. In the face of corruption, you chose integrity. In the face of violence, you chose restraint. In the face of injustice, you chose to fight for what was right, no matter the personal cost. The Army is better because you are in it." The room erupted in applause. Rachel stood at attention, her eyes forward, her face impassive. But inside she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. Not pride exactly, something deeper, satisfaction, purpose. After the ceremony, as Rachel mingled with other officers, a young female lieutenant approached her nervously. "Captain Morgan, I just wanted to say, you are my hero. I am about to deploy to my first duty station and I am scared. Scared I will not be respected. Scared I will fail. But seeing what you did, how you never gave up, it gives me courage." Rachel looked at the young woman and saw herself years earlier, fresh out of officer training, full of idealism and fear. She put a hand on the lieutenant's shoulder. "Listen to me," Rachel said firmly but kindly. "You will face people who doubt you. You will face people who try to tear you down. But remember this, your worth is not determined by what others think of you. It is determined by what you do when nobody is watching, by how you act when things get hard. Do the right thing always, protect your soldiers, stand up for what is just, and never ever let anyone make you feel like you do not belong." The lieutenant nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, ma'am." As the young woman walked away, Rachel felt something she had not felt in years: hope. Hope that the Army was changing, that women like her and that lieutenant would have an easier path than the generations before them. Hope that integrity and courage still mattered in a world that sometimes seemed to reward neither. That evening, Rachel returned to her small apartment in Arlington. She made herself dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta and salad. She ate alone, as she often did, but she did not feel lonely. On her refrigerator, held up by a magnet, was the letter from the soldiers at Fort Henderson. Next to it was a photo of her old combat unit, all of them grinning despite the dust and heat of the desert behind them. 3 of those soldiers had not made it home. Rachel looked at their faces and made them a silent promise. She would never stop fighting for what they had believed in. She would never let their sacrifices be in vain. As night fell over the city, Rachel stood at her window and looked out at the lights of Washington. Somewhere out there, in bases across the country and around the world, soldiers were standing watch. Some were brave, some were scared, some were corrupt, and some were heroes. Rachel's job was to help make sure the heroes had a chance to succeed and the corrupt were brought to justice. It was a big job, an important job, and Rachel knew she was the right person to do it. She touched her cheek, where a faint bruise still remained from Holloway's punch. The bruise would fade in time, but the memory would stay with her forever, not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of strength. She had been hit, but she had not fallen. She had faced injustice, but she had not surrendered. And that, Rachel thought, made all the difference. She had joined the Army to serve her country. She had survived combat to come home with honor. And she had faced corruption to emerge with integrity intact. Rachel Morgan was a soldier, through and through. And she was just getting started. The story of what happened at Fort Henderson spread through military circles for years afterward. It became a case study at West Point, an example of ethical leadership taught to new officers. Staff Sergeant Holloway was sentenced to 15 years in military prison and dishonorably discharged. Colonel Marcus Webb lost his pension and narrowly avoided prison time by cooperating with investigators. But the real legacy was not in the punishments. It was in the changes that followed. New oversight procedures were implemented across the Army. Whistleblower protections were strengthened. And most importantly, a generation of soldiers learned that doing the right thing, even when it was hard, even when it cost you everything, was always worth it. Captain Rachel Morgan went on to serve with distinction for another 15 years before retiring as a full colonel. She never forgot the lesson she learned that day when Holloway hit her and 3 generals walked in. Sometimes justice does not come when you expect it. Sometimes it takes time, sacrifice, and courage to see it through. But it always comes, eventually, for those who never stop fighting for it. And that was a lesson worth remembering.